And that shows how shallow of a, conservative he is. What are you trying to conserve if you can't even conserve traditional marriage? The thing about Matt Walsh is that he has expressed a lot of Zionism in the past. He works for the Daily Wire, which is a Zionist organization. His boss is Ben Shapiro, another Zionist, hardcore Zionist, very anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian. So that's really what Muslims should take from Matt Walsh. A lot of Muslims, unfortunately, seem to like what Matt Walsh has to say because they view him as supporting traditional family values. But even that, I would say, is a facade. And this facade has cracked in certain instances. Recently, for example, he was interviewed by Joe Rogan, and he expressed support for things like gay marriage, and he couldn't bring up any kind of valid objection to same-sex marriage. And that shows how shallow of a, conservative he is. What are you trying to conserve if you can't even conserve traditional marriage? Even though he will have certain kinds of critiques that are interesting or seem to align with traditional religion, it's very shallow. His traditionalism doesn't go very deep. And I have another video where I talk about how people like Ben Shapiro and Matt Walsh are essentially charlatans who are a liberalizing force for Jews and Christians and Catholics because of this appearance of traditionalism, but really it's a liberal message that they push within their programming. So this is dangerous, because people will follow Ben Shapiro or Matt Walsh and think that, okay, these guys are traditional supporters of religion, but really there's a liberal message or a liberal undertone to all of their content. And this is the same exact thing with the compassionate imams or liberal imams, that they have this facade of traditionalism and orthodoxy, but really it's just a liberal message. So if you ask Matt Walsh about certain things in the Bible, like slavery, like minor marriage, if you ask him about the Catholic historical punishments for blasphemy that existed throughout the Catholic Church's history, and you ask him about different papal decrees on heresies, then he will either disavow those things or he'll remain silent. And this again shows that his traditional Catholicism is a facade. So no Muslim, certainly no Catholic or no Christian should think that Matt Walsh is traditional, but certainly no Muslim should ever fall into that kind of trick or fall for that kind of trick. So in this clip, he is talking about Andrew Tate, and he wants to, the title of it is Matt Walsh Responds to Andrew Tate Supporters. So let's just watch this and see what he has to say.
We opened the show yesterday with a discussion about the crisis of masculinity and the rise of Andrew Tate. And to very briefly summarize the key points made in that conversation, boys are growing up in a culture that is openly hostile to masculinity, and many are forced to navigate the minefield without the benefits of strong male role models to show them the path. And this crisis is self-perpetuating. It grows exponentially because the young men with absentee fathers eventually become absentee fathers themselves, repeating the cycle indefinitely unto infinity. And into this field of confusion and man hatred steps guys like Andrew Tate and others, quickly earning an enormous following of young men who understandably flock to somebody who has a message that embraces masculinity rather than treating it like a disease. Andrew Tate, very often good at identifying the problems in our culture as they pertain to the situation that men face, and deserves credit for speaking up in defense of masculinity rather than denigrating it and calling for its eradication, essentially. But in my view, he misses the mark when it comes to the remedy. He seems to basically understand the disease, but he doesn't have the right prescription for it, or at least the full prescription. Yes, men should reject the programming that our culture wants to subject them to, programming which seeks to neuter and feminize them. Yes, they should work hard. They should take care of their minds and their bodies. Yes, they should strive for success, including financial success. But a life of hedonism and materialism and luxurious wealth, remaining unmarried while sleeping with dozens of different women and so on, is not the ideal to strive towards. Rather,
so far, this is correct. I agree with what Matt Walsh is saying here. But, to be fair, this is a video that just came out yesterday or the day before. So, but he's talking about an Andrew Tate that is from the past, because Andrew Tate, very recently, it's only been about a month and a half or so that he has become Muslim. He's converted to Islam, and he's already begun to disavow certain aspects of his past life as a non-Muslim. So it's not exactly fair to characterize Andrew Tate according to his past record. But, to be fair to Matt Walsh, that kind of record is the bulk of Andrew Tate's public persona. And most of the material that he has online does promote this kind of masculinity that I agree with Matt Walsh is just a false solution to the modern crisis of masculinity. Masculinity doesn't mean driving, supercars and sleeping around and, smoking cigars and all of this. And I've given this critique of Andrew Tate myself prior to him becoming a Muslim. If he continued that kind of lifestyle as a Muslim, then we would still critique him in that same vein. And Matt Walsh would be justified in that. But Andrew Tate has changed, and now he's in prison. He's been targeted by international authorities to be silenced. And so now it's a completely different situation. And he's quoting on his social media Quran. He's quoting Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah. It's a completely different persona. And why? Why has Andrew Tate changed? Well, part of it is because he's now a Muslim, and when you quote Quran, it shows sincerity. It shows that, okay, he is willing to express his beliefs despite that expression alienating a huge portion of his fan base, because a huge portion of his fan base was Christian. More than 50% probably were Christian conservatives, and he has essentially alienated a segment of them by not only becoming Muslim, converting to Islam very publicly. He could have done it privately, he could have done it secretly, but he did it very publicly. And now he just continuously is quoting Quran, quoting Hadith. So this is something that indicates sincerity. Only Allah knows what's in a person's heart, but these are signs or indications for us.
They're what men are called to and created for, and the only sort of life that will be truly happy, that they'll find true happiness and joy in, is a life of service as protector and provider. Men, the vast majority of men anyway, are called to be husbands and fathers, to be leaders of their families. Now, they may be called to lead in other ways too, but first they must care for their families. If there's any saving our civilization at this point, which I think there is, but if there is, this is how it will be done. And this is who will do it. It's not going to be saved by influencers who are sitting in front of cameras, whether the guy in front of the camera is Andrew Tate or me or anyone else. It'll be saved through the formation and preservation of strong, intact, loving, and well-led families. That is the...
I find it interesting that as a religious person, he hasn't really mentioned God as being part of the solution. He didn't mention God as being essential to manhood and being a man. This seems like a omission, like an obvious omission from a religious person. As Muslims, we know that being a success in life requires not only belief in God, but submission to God, submission to the Creator. And to avoid associating partners with your Creator and worshiping other than your Creator. That is really significant about, being a real man. But Matt Walsh, and there are analogs to the importance of worship, the importance of submitting to God in Christianity and other traditional religions. But again, this is Matt Walsh speaking in a kind of secular way to his audience. So I think that's notable.
It is the only way forward. If every man in the country starts going to the gym and starts making lots of money and starts having sex with lots of attractive women, and yet they don't get married and stay married and have children and raise and love those children, then we will still be headed to ruin. It'll be a slightly different kind of ruin, but ruin all the same. Those men themselves will ultimately find the happiness that they are able to derive in that lifestyle. They'll find that it's shallow and it's fleeting. And in the end, they'll die alone, loved by no one, loving no one, remembered by no one, leaving no legacy behind. The feminized and neutered and effeminate man that our left-wing culture seeks to create, and then this other sort of man, both unmarried, both childless, will look very similar in the end, having taken two very different paths just to arrive together at essentially the same place.
But that's also what disbelief is. So you can have someone who follows a hedonistic lifestyle, doesn't get married, doesn't have children, is just engaged in all kinds of fornication, party lifestyle. And then you have another person who gets married, has children, has all of these things that Matt Walsh is promoting in his life, but without God, without any kind of higher purpose, then both of those people end up in the same place as well. Both of those people end up with the same kind of demise in the afterlife. So that's something, again, this is a very secular message from Matt Walsh, that just having, does he actually think that you can be a secular person and get married and have children and be an atheist and have a good result? Even in life, even in terms of life satisfaction or happiness levels, is that possible? If Matt Walsh doesn't think it's possible, then why is he indicating otherwise? Is it because he is trying to cater to as wide an audience as possible that includes not only Christians, but also other religions or no religion? So this is not an authentic message. It's not an authentic religious message. I don't understand how anyone who does have religious affinities or is a religious person is going to find much inspiration in what Matt Walsh has to say on this topic or any topic.
It's the family man, the devoted father and husband, whose different path actually leads to a different and much better conclusion. Now, I've, of course, been preaching this message for as long as I've had an audience to preach to, and I have found that there are like 2 or 3 basic responses or rebuttals, I guess, that I always hear from young men who may, for the most part, line up with me ideologically, but who doubt the wisdom of the get married and have kids prescription. And I was greeted with these same responses after the show yesterday and many messages and comments. What I'd like to do today is answer the objections, or at least what seems to be the one principal objection. The claim that I so often hear is that, well, marriage and family life is a trap. It's a scam, especially for men. The whole thing is rigged against us. There is nothing for a man to do but give up on the entire enterprise and go his own way. In fact, there's a whole movement online, men go their own way. And that's basically the idea. Just give up on this stuff and do something else. This argument was summarized in a comment from a listener named Joshua, which I'll read because I think it just is representative of this sort of mentality. He says, still sounds like Matt and most tradcons' definition of what masculinity means is exclusively through the lens of women and children's wants and needs. Unfortunately, that ideal will no longer work in the modern world with birth control, hookup culture, social media, and court systems that favor women and the denigration of traditional masculinity. I don't agree with all of Tate's views, but it sure beats Matt's prescriptions for young men. Again, I've read a great many comments making the same kind of point. A private message from another listener has a similar theme. It says, Matt, I agree with many of your opinions, but your message to men is off base. Young men follow Andrew Tate because his lifestyle is the ideal, whether you admit it or not. Wealth, fame, status, beautiful women were biologically programmed to want those things. Marriage is a losing game. The only solution in modern society is to reject the life of service, as you call it. So what is the problem with this view? Well, to begin with, it's nothing less than a full, unconditional surrender to the culture. It's true that the culture has increasingly made it difficult for both men and women to form and maintain strong, intact, lasting families. And that's because the elites who run our society don't want you to live that kind of life. They prefer that you focus on your individual wants, on fulfilling your own needs and satisfying your own desires. That's what they prefer for you. That's the life they want for you. A self-focused life is precisely the sort of life they wish for you. Makes you easier to manipulate, less of a threat to their agenda. Not really a threat at all. I mean, if you're just out there focused on yourself, being a consumer, buying lots of things for yourself, consuming things for yourself, and all the rest of it, you're not a threat to their agenda at all. I mean, you're going along with it.
This seems like a very weird response to MGTOW, like men going their own way, or incels or red pill. The response that Matt Walsh is giving is that, no, you shouldn't go your own way. You should get married because guess what? The elites don't want you to get married. So you should get married. That's not a very compelling response, or it's definitely not a compelling, reason to get married. I'm just going to do what the elites don't want me to do. And it seems like he's ignoring the main criticism that these red pill manosphere speakers have, or influencers have, is that the problem with society today and what the elites have imposed is this gynocentrism or female dominance, this feminism, where female preferences are prioritized, and legally divorce is in the hands of women, which makes men in marriages at the mercy of a woman who can divorce him and take all his property, take his children, and destroy his life. They are making a systemic critique of the world as it is, that is actually established and set up by these elites that Matt Walsh is supposedly criticizing. But he kind of ignores that feminist component of the problem. So that seems like a very strange, or it's like a tone-deaf response from Matt Walsh. Does he just not want to offend, his female audience? I don't know.
All of the things mentioned by Joshua in his comment, all of those things represent a conspiracy against the family. He's right about that. The way the family court systems are set up, birth control, all the rest of it. It's an attack on the family. So what is the answer? To give up?
But
to give the conspiracy?
It's an attack on the family in a very specific, according to a very specific ideology of liberal feminism. That's the way that the family is being attacked, but he's not getting to the core of it in this, at least in this clip.
Conspirators is exactly what they want? To reward them for their efforts by turning your back on the very thing they've been assaulting for decades? The family is the fortress that they have been attacking. And you can defend it with your life, or you can wave the white flag. But if you choose to surrender, then at least be honest about what you're doing. Be honest, this is not a rejection of the left's agenda, of a cultural elite's agenda. You are submitting to it. It is a submission. It is certainly not the strong or masculine response to run away and abandon your post, to stop fighting because the fight is too difficult. I mean, that approach is many things, but it certainly isn't manly. What is the next move? To give up on the family is to give up on human civilization, seeing as how there cannot be a human civilization without the family. So what's plan B after you've given up on civilization? What's next?
I mean, this is a very silly kind of response. Like, the problem that people are bringing up with marriage is not like, oh, I'm just going to give up because I really... there's a wonderful wife and family there waiting for me, and I just have to choose it. And it just requires me to be brave enough to actually do that. This is not the reality. The reality is that all men, all normal men, especially religious men, that's what they really desire. That's what they really want. And even Andrew Tate, in his bad boy, playboy phase, would express that, yeah, I want to have a devoted wife, I want to have children, I want to have this family, but the system has made it impossible. The matrix, as Andrew Tate would put it, has made it impossible for me to do that. So despite wanting that more than anything, I can't achieve that. I can't get that because of feminism, because, all the women who are, within marriageable age range, they have been told, no, don't get married, don't be independent, go to college, go get your PhD, go get a fulfilling career. You need no man. Just sleep around. That's enough. You don't need to shackle yourself to a man through marriage. This is the message that's given to women. And that's why you have this death of marriage that's happening, where people just don't want to get married. And it's driven by a lack of supply, the supply being women. Women are not on the marriage market. So when there aren't enough women who want to get married, there's going to be a lot of men who want to get married, but there's just no one to marry. And Muslim brothers know this more than anyone, how difficult it is to find someone to marry. And some of them are in their 40s now, young men who they just cannot find a spouse, despite years of trying and having all kinds of advantages in terms of their looks, in terms of their finances, but they just can't find a spouse. So Matt Walsh is characterizing this as men just need to step up. Men just need to man up, and everything will fall into place. But he's not acknowledging the reality that it's not in the control of these men.
You're also giving up on yourself, on your own legacy, your own bloodline. You are descended from a long line of men stretching back thousands of years who formed families and raised children, often under circumstances far more dire than what we face.
No, none of these ancestors faced what we face in terms of the liberal program. That's also a blatant mischaracterization. Yeah, everyone has challenges, but the challenges that we're facing now because of feminism are absolutely unique. If you look at our ancestors didn't have to deal with the problem of women in the prime of their youth going to college and renouncing marriage, renouncing, the whole idea of a family. This is unprecedented. He kind of referred to divorce courts and the legal system. That legal system is unprecedented. It's only arisen in the past 60 years due to feminist reforms of the legal system. So this is, again, he's just not conversant with the history or the reality.
And you're giving up on them too. You are surrendering your future and your past. You're giving up on everything. And what is your consolation prize? Finding financial success? I mean, the unfortunate irony is that many of the men who give up on these things in favor of, well, I'll just focus on myself and try to be financially successful, many of them are never even going to be financially successful. So they end up with just nothing. They end up broke and alone with nothing. But even if you find it, the financial success, so what? I mean, who cares about money if you have nothing meaningful to spend it on? I have money. I don't have Andrew Tate's money, but I have money. And nearly all the joy and happiness I derive from having money is that it allows me to provide for my family. That's pretty much it. That's the entire thing. That's why I like having the money, is that I find great pleasure in being able to care for a wife and 6 kids. Proud of that fact. If I didn't have them, the money would mean very little to me. I mean, I could buy nice things and drive a fancy car and live in my nice house alone. But for what? Now, does that mean that if you start a family that you're guaranteed to live a joyful and fulfilled life? Well, of course not. It's a risk. And yes, the risks are in some ways much greater in modern times. We have all been poisoned by this demonic culture to one extent or another. We are all poisoned. If you marry someone, you are marrying someone who has been poisoned, who has ingested the poison, who has, had taken a drink from the well of modern culture. Everybody has, as have you. And yes, if things go sideways, if you're a man, you marry a woman and your wife turns out to be a disloyal vulture, or if you turn out to be a disloyal vulture, or you both do, the deck will be stacked against you in court. No, there's no question about that. Divorce may ruin your life. And, you know, if you give your heart to someone, if you bind yourself to them, not only through the marriage vow, but then also through children you conceive together, then they will have all they need to rip your guts out and burn your life to the ground. That is absolutely true. That's the risk. Okay. But it's a risk worth taking. Every great joy can become a great tragedy if you aren't careful, or if you have very bad luck. That's true. So is the answer then to forego all joy? To say forget about joy because it might not work out?
This is so bizarre. This is bizarre on many different levels. You know, if the way he characterizes it is, okay, if I give you the choice, you know, you can, if you drink this, I'll give you, you know, something to drink. There's a 99.9% chance this is poison. And there's a 0.001% chance that you drink this, there's no problem. And if you survive, I'll give you $1 million or $1 billion. Are you going to drink this? Right? That's the way he's characterizing marriage. Yeah, it's really, really risky, and your guts are going to be ripped out. You're going to be absolutely destroyed and devastated, but it's a risk worth taking, because in the off chance that you're lucky, you're gonna have some joy. So that's, who would take that out? Like, you can be a bachelor and not get married and not, you know, suffer those kinds of consequences. I don't advocate that necessarily, but I can conceive of a situation where it's so bad that I'll say, actually, no, you shouldn't get married. Like, you should not get married, given the context, given the social situation. It's actually a threat to your life. You're going to destroy your life if you get married. I can conceive of a situation in the future, if feminism continues in this path, liberalism continues in this path, they make it so difficult or so disadvantageous to get married, the liberal powers, that there's such a huge chance that you'll be crushed. Then you can conceive of a fatwa that says, actually, it's haram to get married in our situation today. So, but for Matt Walsh, it doesn't seem like that could ever be a possibility, because it's always worth it. In the off chance, it's always worth it. The other thing I found really strange about what Matt Walsh is saying here about, if you don't get married, how can you find the joy? Isn't he a Catholic? Like, don't Catholics have celibacy? Like, isn't that something considered very meritorious? And isn't that like the path of Christ, according to them? Like, the path of Christ didn't get married, and he put off the world, right, for the higher kingdom, right? And that's part of his message. That's arguably, according to Christians, that's his core message. And in Catholic tradition, it is considered meritorious and religiously not only valid, but one of the highest things that you can do is to take a vow of celibacy and dedicate your life to Christ, whether you're a nun or you become a priest. So how can he say, like, he's not acknowledging the possibility of celibacy still leading to plenty of joy, the greatest joy according to his tradition. So that's, again, this is his secular message is completely it's completely non-existent within his message. There's a comment here that I thought was good. It almost feels like Matt Walsh uses Christianity as a way to garner support from the Christian right, not as something sincerely part of his argument. He just supports, quote unquote, traditionalism, nothing more. Yeah, that's a great point.
To embrace a life of loneliness and misery because you're worried that if you aim higher, you'll end up lonely and miserable? You're worried that in the end, you'll end up in this state. So instead you say, well, I might as well just live in this state to begin with.
I mean, the kind of misery that you experience For example, when you've been divorced and your children have been taken away from you, that's a worse misery than not having children. Arguably, I can imagine that. May Allah protect all of us and keep us safe from that kind of situation. But I think it's pretty torturous to know that you have children and you can't see them, or you have children and your wife is deciding, yeah, your son is actually a daughter and he needs to go through, or she needs to go through, gender affirmation therapy, and you can't do anything about it as the father. That I think is torture. Or, there are situations where the ex-wife leaves Islam and she has this kind of rabid agenda against the children to make sure the children don't become Muslim, just as a way to torture the father. Imagine that kind of misery. So I don't think it's obvious that that kind of torture is equivalent to never having gotten married and never having children. They're both miserable, for sure. They're both miserable, but which one is worse? I don't think. This is the kind of situation. These are the kinds of choices that men are given in this feminist world.
Doesn't make any sense. So you take the risk and you mitigate the risk at the same time by being smart about who you marry and by grounding your marriage and your family in faith and mutual devotion, and by working hard every day to hold up your own end of the bargain. Because there are some men out there who do everything right, and they're great men and they're devoted to their families and they're intensely loyal and all of that, and their families fall apart anyway because they accidentally married a soulless, disloyal scumbag. I mean, that does happen. And sometimes it happens in the reverse. But that's not the majority of cases.
How do you know?
Most of the time it takes two to tango. Two to get married, two to ruin the marriage. Which means that marriage...
So, first of all, he's just declaring that. It seems opposite of what he said earlier, where he said that it's a risk because the odds are so much against you that you're going to have this terrible marriage because of the culture and the poison, that everyone has drunk this poison. But now he's kind of shifting it, and he's saying, oh, the majority of cases aren't bad. So how does he know? Like 50% as it is in the Western world, and increasingly throughout the world, 50% of the marriages end in divorce. And if your wife is college educated, that percentage just goes way up. Most divorces are initiated by women. Over 75% of divorces are initiated by women. Women want out. So why does he have this kind of characterization? And then he says it takes two to tango. So he's putting blame back on the men. So this is it's no wonder that people who do this red pill MGTOW are so frustrated, because people like Matt Walsh are gaslighting on the whole issue.
Is not a mere roll of the dice. There's quite a lot you can do to secure your good fortune. That's why I never cared about the statistics. When I was getting married and I heard about this, statistically, I'm not a statistic. I'm not just some number on a spreadsheet. And neither is my wife. We're human beings. I'm not subject to statistics. Not merely subject to them. Because the one thing statistics don't take into account are choices. It's about the choices you make. Whether your marriage works or not, it's about choices that are made in the marriage. If one or both of you make bad choices, your chances are going to be very poor. If you make good choices, they won't be. That's what it is.
But people are conditioned. The problem is that people are conditioned to think and act in a certain way that influences their choices. That's the whole point of your analogy with drinking the poison. People are poisoned. They have this toxic mentality, and therefore they make bad choices. And that is something that you can statistically measure. That's how we know that the situation is as bad as it is. There was a recent study that by 2030, 41% or 51% of women will be single without children. And that's like the highest that's ever been. Well, obviously, all of those women in 2030 and today, they're making choices about whether to get married, whether to have children. they're the primary, the female, just because of biology, the female is the one who determines whether reproduction takes place. And so the women have the control over that. They're making decisions not to get married. And it's because of what? It's ideology that's influencing their thinking. It's that culture. So you have to address that. You have to address that big elephant in the room. And instead of gaslighting men or telling men that, oh, you don't worry about statistics. So this is very tone deaf, and it's a poor critique of Andrew Tate. This doesn't really address the non-Muslim Andrew Tate's arguments.
And yet the risk is always there. So will you live in fear of it, or will you have the courage? It's just not true. Okay, it's just not true that a life of obscene luxury and materialism and selfishness and self-service and of, sleeping with many different women and all of that, it's not true that that is the ideal,
Agreed.
Which we so often hear these days. That's the ideal. Non-monogamy, having many sexual partners, that's the ideal, they say. That's not true. Much less is it what we are biologically programmed to desire. No, it's what we're culturally programmed to desire. That is the cultural programming. But I know that it's not biological because I'm a biological organism and I don't desire that. I don't want any life but the one I have. I don't want any woman but the one I married. I mean, you could listen to that and say, oh, that's not true. He's just saying it. That's a cope on your part. That's resentment, envy talking. If I could do my life over from the start, I would find my wife again and marry her again. If I lived 100 lives, I'd marry her in all of them. That's what it means to love somebody. And love is the ideal because it's not mere biological programming. It is transcendent. And trust me, it's well worth the risk.
There's a lot of confusion and mixed messages in that. And, some people in the comments are saying, what about polygyny? He's just promoting monogamy, but polygyny should also be considered to be a fulfilling, transcendent experience. Don't play this clip for your wife or turn it off if she's in the room. But yeah, this is just a really conservatard is the word, boomer type understanding of the world. Like just men need to step up. Yeah, very disappointing message. And what do you expect from this guy? As Muslims, we really don't need to follow his lead or take inspiration from what he says. It's just a Republican message, basically, right-wing Republican message that has been sanitized. That's my advice to Muslims. And in the end, I agree that, and the other thing is that Muslims, we have a model. Like we have the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to follow. And we know that the importance of marriage, we know that hedonism is, and following your desires is a fool's path. It's the path of Satan. No doubt about that. But we should acknowledge the reality and the dangers and the problems with the social system and with the marriage process that we see around us. The problem of feminism, we can't ignore that and still push a message of marriage, because that's being tone deaf. That's only going to exacerbate the problem. And Islam is about solutions, not about exacerbating and inflaming a bad situation and making it worse.